The death of the only man ever convicted for the 1988 bombing of a Pan Am jet over Scotland has left some of the victims' relatives relieved, while others continue to question the soundness of the conviction and whether the real culprit isn't still at large. Has justice been served, or should a new independent and thorough investigation be carried out? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Ghida Fakhry. Welcome to the program. Abdel Baset Al-Megrahi, who was sentenced to life in prison for the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103, died on Sunday. He was convicted in 2001 but has maintained his innocence. Megrahi's lawyers accused British and US authorities of tampering with the evidence during the investigation and disregarding witness statements. They also accused them of steering investigators away from suggestions the bombing may have been an Iranian-financed plot to avenge the downing of a civilian Iranian airliner by a US warship that killed some 290 people several months before the Lockerbie bombing. The judicial body denied theories of any intentional misdirection. On the day of Megrahi's funeral, there were renewed calls for a new probe, and the Scottish government is now facing increasing pressure to launch an independent inquiry into the Lockerbie bombing. John Ashton has been speaking to families of some of the American passengers killed in the bombing.
Helen Engelhardt won't be grieving for Al-Megrahi. She prefers not to think about him at all. She's convinced he took her husband Tony's life 24 years ago and those of 269 others.
My first reaction was, so? It's about time.
A rift has opened up between the US family members like Helen and their UK counterparts, led by Dr. Jim Swire, the father of a victim who's long been convinced of Megrahi's innocence.
Well, I'm half sad but half a bit relieved because I knew this man quite well, and because I'd become satisfied in nothing to do with Lockerbie, he'd become my friend, and I met him last in December last year, and he was in a lot of pain then, and I knew he would have been in a lot of pain in between, so at least his death has brought his pain and his suffering to an end.
The American families, however, tend to think justice was served when Megrahi was convicted, and his release by Scottish authorities on compassionate grounds in 2009 was wrong.
Why the British families feel the way they do, and I don't know how many of them do. I know that Dr. Swire is obsessed with this and went to visit Mr. Gaddafi to commiserate with him after the Americans bombed Tripoli, which I will just leave it at that.
It's said Megrahi wanted to reveal more about the Lockerbie bombing before he died. But Helen Engelhardt's got more to say too. Her memoirs will be published in September. She's looking to the Megrahi family to fill in some of the blanks. John Ashton, Al Jazeera, New York.
So should Megrahi's death mean the closure of the Lockerbie file? Well, to help us answer this question, we're joined by our guests in London. John Ashton, researcher and author on the Lockerbie bombing. He was also a member of Megrahi's legal defense team. In London as well, Alan Mendoza, executive director of the Henry Jackson Society, a foreign policy think tank with expertise in Libya. The group was a part of a campaign against Megrahi's release in 2009. And in Birmingham, we have Mohamed Eljarh. He is a Libyan academic researcher and activist. Welcome to you all. John Ashton, obviously a lot of mixed, conflicting emotions surrounding this case, but should the case be reopened? And how sound was the conviction, given what we now know about some of the, what some people might say, was the flimsy evidence that was used to convict?
It was extraordinarily flimsy, and just to fill in your viewers, there was a United Nations trial observer at Megrahi's trial who described the guilty verdict as incomprehensible and has since been campaigning on Megrahi's behalf, which is fairly remarkable. The Scottish Criminal Cases Review Commission studied his case for 4 years. That's a statutory body that has the power to refer cases back to the appeal court. It did so on no fewer than 6 grounds, which again is fairly extraordinary. One of those grounds was that the original trial court judgment was unreasonable. So it's not only me who believes this. There's a substantial body of well-informed opinion that shares that view.
Mohamed Eljarh, so there may have been substantial ground to appeal. Just how important then is it for Libyans today to have this case reopened? How realistic is it to reverse the conviction if indeed there was a miscarriage of justice?
Well, I think the case, I mean, throughout the case, there hasn't been concentration on the suffering of the Libyan people that they have encountered throughout this ordeal. With the sanctions and having to actually, I would only describe the suffering of the Libyan people throughout this ordeal as a mass punishment when applying the sanctions. And I think the Libyan people have the right at the moment to make sense of the last 42 years, not just the Lockerbie bombing, but at the moment we're trying to make sense of what's been going on. And what we've been accused of, any terrorist acts and so on. So I think it is very important for the new Libya to come to terms and try and really understand what's been going on with the Lockerbie and whether Al-Megrahi was rightly convicted or not. He insisted that he was innocent to the moment he died. And that, I think the Libyans have as much right as the victims of the families to really know exactly what's been or what exactly has happened.
Alan Mendoza, you long campaigned, forgive me for interrupting, but Alan Mendoza long campaigned against Megrahi, believing that the right man was convicted. Isn't this case much bigger than Megrahi, though? Not just the potential miscarriage of justice involving one man, but the fact that, as Mohamed Eljarh points out, there was collective punishment, that the UN Security Council, in a way that was quite unprecedented, intervened in a criminal case, imposed biting sanctions on Libya for very many years, when it was still an issue of allegations against Libya, when no one was convicted. Isn't that tantamount to collective punishment, a crime under international law? Does that trouble you?
Well, I don't think it troubles me because, of course, in this context, if you look at the countries involved, intelligence, one assumes, was gathered in this regard to lead to the conclusion that the Libyan regime of Gaddafi was responsible. And I think we do need to make this quite clear. This is not about the new Libya, this is about the old Libya of the heinous crimes of the Gaddafi regime internationally. We know what this man did to his own people, horrific. We know what this man was happy to do internationally, also horrific. So from this point of view, you can understand why there were sanctions applied against his regime. And just on the Al-Megrahi case itself, look, I think I share the Prime Minister's view, the British Prime Minister's view. If a man is convicted of a crime in judicial process, which he was, then he should stay in prison until his death, or until an appeal is heard where that is overturned. Everything else is merely opinion at this stage.
Is it, though, for anyone seeking justice and closure, to have a case closed on the basis of what has now appeared to have been less than solid evidence, and on the narrative, the ever-changing, inconsistent narrative of a key witness, someone who goes by the name of Tony Gauci, who was a shopkeeper in Malta, who tied Libya to this crime and indeed tied Megrahi to the crime?
Well, look, there are two things here. Firstly, when it comes to witness narrative, obviously the passage of years probably makes a difference in terms of that. I think the closer you are to the crime, the alleged crime, the more likely you are to have an interesting sort of viewpoint and recollection. But leaving that aside, the Scottish First Minister has declared it is perfectly possible for Al-Megrahi's relatives to go for an appeal at this stage. At the moment, all we have is opinion. You know, I do recognise, of course, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a jurist in this regard. I know that one of the other panellists has been involved in the case. I'm not going to dispute what he or has seen or what he thinks he's seen in the trial evidence. But from the point of view of legal process, you have an appeal and you look at it that way rather than making opinion and assessment from the outside.
John Ashton, do you agree with this? Is it just opinion and assessment, or is there new evidence that has emerged that suggests there is serious reason to doubt the conviction?
Well, look, the evidence was there from the start, and Mohamed Eljarh was absolutely right. Libya was found guilty and punished by the United Nations many years before this case went to court, and that those sanctions, which were very biting and which damaged the Libyan people an awful lot, were based on evidence that was at best shaky and at worst concocted. Now, the authorities that conducted that investigation and the authorities that forced through those United Nations sanctions should hang their heads in shame, because they either knew or should have known that that evidence didn't stack up, that that evidence didn't prove Libya's guilt beyond reasonable doubt. And this is the hidden scandal, or the scandal that is never spoken about.
Why would Libya have been framed, though? How easily could it have been planted? When you talk about key evidence, there is that key, crucial piece of evidence. Let me just be specific here. The tiny piece of circuit board that was found hundreds of miles away from the main impact site. That has come to light recently because it was made available to the defense team. Forensic review of this suggests that it did not come from the source that the prosecution had identified. How much does this undermine the prosecution case then?
Well, it absolutely destroys the prosecution case. Now, this piece of circuit board, we can now prove, was not from a timing device that was supplied to Libya. The whole Crown case against Megrahi and against Libya was that this fragment of circuit board was part of a timing device that was sold exclusively to Libya. Now, we've been able to prove that that's not the case. Moreover, we have evidence that the Crown was in possession of, which proves that they knew that there was a major anomaly with this evidence that was not given to the defence. Now, had that evidence been properly explored in advance of Megrahi and his co-accused being indicted, then those indictments should never have been brought, and the Libyan people should never have suffered 12 years of sanctions. This is a really monstrous scandal, and it's never talked about.
Alan Mendoza, what about these admissions that are now being made at the highest levels of the Scottish government, at least, the First Minister in Scotland, Alex Salmond, saying that, and I quote him, "The death of Megrahi ends one chapter of the Lockerbie case, but it does not close the book." Lingering questions then that there might have been a cover-up, or at the very least that some governments obstructed any real attempt to properly investigate this conviction.
Well, I think Mr. Salmond also said essentially that even at the time there was a widely held theory and indeed a statement that Al-Megrahi didn't act alone. It's clear there's been a cover-up to a certain extent in that we do not know the full facts. One of the men who knew the full facts is now dead, or some of the facts at least is now dead. Another man, Gaddafi, also dead, so that won't help us in that respect. Again, I go back to this point though, we're talking about proof here. Proof, to a certain extent is determined by, what you discover, what you don't, how this is actually challenged by experts and other people. But proof in a court of law is a different thing. I encourage people to go and take up Alex Salmond's sort of offer and go and appeal the verdict. Go back and appeal it. That's how you have real legal proof. That's where you bring the higher standard of proof that is required, rather than it just being opinion. At present, I'm sorry, it's not proof, it is opinion.
How likely is that to happen, Mohamed Eljarh? Could the relatives of Megrahi appeal this case on his behalf? Are they likely to?
Well, the spokesperson for the NTC, Mohamed Al-Harizi, said that the case for Lockerbie to Libya is not yet over, and I am sure that the Libyan government will want to show the world and to show the Libyan and bring closure to the Libyans for this ordeal. So I think the Libyan government's position is that they want the appeal to go ahead and the case to be reopened and investigated, especially with recent evidence that became available that was not available earlier on in the case. And it is in Libya's interest to actually know exactly what the Western countries, for example, the UK, the release of Abdel Baset Al-Megrahi anyway, or the dealings with Gaddafi even before the release of Abdel Baset Al-Megrahi. So there's been backroom deals on the back of the suffering of Libyans. It's only the Libyan people that have suffered from the sanctions. It's not Gaddafi or his people or his inner circle. They still made deals, they still met with Western diplomats and so on. So the deals with Gaddafi still went on. It's only the Libyan people that have actually been punished because of that. So the Libyan government's position at the moment is that they want the case to be reopened. It's not over yet. We need to come to terms what's been going on in the last 42 years, and part of it, a large part of it, is the Lockerbie. The education sector in Libya suffered. The health sector in Libya suffered. The Libyan people were almost in sorts of unspeakable circumstances during the sanctions.
John Ashton, do you believe then that the current government, the Libyan government, is in a position to want to revisit this ordeal as it was for the country and all the opportunity cost that it engendered with the sanctions, with the billions of dollars, $2.7 billion in compensation that Gaddafi agreed to pay the families of the victims? Would it be in its interest to reopen this, or would it be too embarrassing for some of its Western allies?
Well, it's in the people's interest, I think, because the truth always serves the public interest. But I think they will be under enormous pressure not to reopen this case. It's difficult to read what the Libyan government's view on this is. I don't think they speak with one voice. There are various senior people who have suggested that Megrahi, and by extension Gaddafi, was guilty. There are others who've suggested that Megrahi was innocent. I hope the latter voices prevail, or at least the voices who are in favour of exploring this case further and trying to get to the bottom of it.
Well, when Megrahi was released in August of 2009 on compassionate grounds, the Libyan media back then portrayed it as a victory and an honourable end to this entire saga. Libya's former leader, Muammar Gaddafi, appeared eager to normalise relations with the West. I interviewed Colonel Gaddafi a month after Megrahi's release. He repeatedly argued the case was closed and it was time for Libya to move on. But would you like to see the case appealed? Do you still believe that Libya, at least in the court of public opinion in the West, has been unfairly convicted?
هذه مشكلة انتهت، ما عادش إمكانية لأن احنا تبرر نناقشها.
This problem ended. It is not possible anymore to talk about clearing Libya or not. Whatever happened, the problem is over. Abdel Baset was the only person who had the right to appeal to the European Court. But as I said, because of his illness and release, it seems there is no need for appeal.
Alan Mendoza, does it sound perhaps like the Libyan leader there was cutting a deal, agreeing to the release of Megrahi on compassionate grounds for political expediency in order to secure commercial interest for Libya, for Western countries? Did he forego justice for an entire nation in order to do this?
Well, you could look at it that way. That was one possibility until and unless we ever see the diplomatic records, we won't know. The other, of course, option is here's a man who knows he is complicit in the crime and is very happy to have what he would term an honourable settlement in this way, where he can present some kind of victory from the jaws of defeat and present it that way. There are two ways of looking at every situation there.
Mohamed Eljarh, how do you feel when you hear Colonel Gaddafi say that the case was closed, that when Megrahi himself said also that for 18 years he had been the victim of politics, now finally he became its beneficiary?
That's one of the very, very reasons why the Libyan people should urge their new government to carry on with the case, because Gaddafi has never wanted any good for Libya or any good for the Libyan people. And I think that the very fact that he didn't want this case to be reopened because he hailed it as a victory and so on, for that reason, I think the Libyan government and the Libyan people have the full right to actually go ahead and pursue the case and go to the bottom of what has actually happened. As Libyans and as Libya, we need to come to terms with the years that we've been under sanctions and embargoes, and it's been a collective punishment based on, as John was saying, shaky evidence.
John Ashton, if, as Jim Swire, the father of one of the victims of this bombing, believes that evidence is yet to come out that will eventually prove that Megrahi was innocent of this crime, what happens then? Who compensates all these Libyan people who have really paid quite dearly all these years under sanctions?
Well, that's a very good question. That's a very good question. The countries that brought those sanctions, that forced through those sanctions, which is the UK and the United States, should if there's any justice, compensate the Libyan people for their suffering. I think that's very, very unlikely to happen. I don't think we will ever quite get to the bottom of the case. We can destroy the case against Megrahi. I think it's going to be impossible to fully destroy the case against the Libyan government or against any other government that was likely to be involved. And I take the view that Libyan government involvement was either slight or non-existent. I think that this attack was commissioned by the Iranian government.
Why didn't the prosecution then, Alan Mendoza, follow that track that Iran may have had more of an incentive, more motive to take part in such a bombing, to avenge the downing of an Iranian airliner by the United States? Why not pursue that track?
Well, obviously they decided not to pursue that track because they felt they had secured the evidence to go down another track. I mean, that's what prosecutors do. I mean, at the end of the day, when you look at prosecuting a criminal case, you go with what evidence you have the most of, and you decide to follow that course. Here it's quite clear.
Some people would suggest the evidence could have easily been planted. We're talking about a very minuscule fragment of circuit board found hundreds of miles away from the impact site. I mean, this could have been planted, couldn't it?
Well, let's just return. Well, of course it could have been planted, but then again, every evidence case in any criminal case in history could have been planted in theory. It's up to someone to bring an appeal and prove that in the court of law. I mean, there are people today who believe that that man didn't land on the moon. There are people today who believe that Jack Kennedy was assassinated by the mafia. I mean, because they believe it doesn't mean it was so. They have to prove it. That's what legal process is for. It's about proving things to a high standard and going forward in that way. And to move on to the Iran issue, yes, there obviously was an Iranian motive as well, but there of course was a Libyan motive. This was the era when Libya was riding high on the coattails of international terrorism, pushing its own contacts with international terrorist groups, and it also had a motive given the Tripoli bombings. It could have quite happily have acted on that motive as well. So I don't think it's a far-fetched notion to suggest the Libyans had no motive here. And again, to go on the Gaddafi point beforehand, it seems quite clear to me that one very plausible explanation for the colonel's willingness to actually close the case was that he knew that he was complicit in some way, shape or form. And as a result, he was quite happy to have secured a minor victory so that he could at least close this, so that his honour was in some way saved from the stain that had besmirched it.
John Ashton, your thoughts on this? Megrahi has told you that it was a horrible decision for him to decide to drop his appeal and decide to return home on compassionate grounds. How much pressure was on him to drop this appeal? And do you believe that if the second appeal had gone through, he would have been acquitted?
I absolutely do, yes. He had a very, very strong case. And had that appeal gone forward and had he won it, then it would have brought the Scottish criminal justice system into huge disrepute. The pressure on him to drop his appeal was objectively fairly slight, but subjectively, for a man who was suffering terminal cancer, was immense. He didn't need much encouragement, or he didn't need much of a nudge, because he was so desperate to drop the appeal.
Where does this then finally go from here?
Well, a number of things have to happen. The case needs to be reopened. It needs to go back to the appeal court. There is a mechanism for doing that. Secondly, there has to be a proper inquiry as to why the Scottish government, or should I say the Scottish Crown Office, which is an agency of the Scottish government, withheld so much evidence from Megrahi's trial court. And thirdly, there has to be a proper inquiry into the bombing itself, who did it, insofar as we can determine that, and why so many warnings of an imminent attack on a US airliner were not passed on to the public. Had they been passed on, many, if not all of those victims would still be alive.
Obviously, still many lingering questions. That's all the time we have for this edition of Inside Story. Thanks to all of our guests in London, John Ashton, in Birmingham, Mohamed Eljarh, and in London as well, Alan Mendoza. And thank you very much for joining us for this edition of Inside Story. Of course, your feedback is always welcome. Just email your thoughts to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. From me, Ghida Fakhry, and the entire team, thanks for watching.